Since Ofsted introduced a new framework in 2019, small village primary schools have seen their inspection grades plummet. Is this because they were not that good in the first place, or has Ofsted's framework punished small schools by setting criteria that are unrealistic for them to achieve? I have been tracking this issue for several years. Now we are going to look at the evidence. The issue of small schools being inspected by Ofsted under its 2019 framework and downgraded has been in the press several times over the last few years. The Times Educational Supplement covered the story in 2022 with input and analysis from myself and others. In fact, I had noticed this problem within a year of the framework, despite the disruption caused by COVID. In a webinar in 2022, Ofsted explained that it defines small schools as 150 pupils or less. I think most people would say there are some significant differences of schools, say, of 75 pupils compared to 150. And of course, there are many schools that are fewer than 100. Inspectors were asked for examples of small schools judged to be outstanding, but in that meeting were not able to name any. We are seeing schools judged as outstanding, they said, but this was certainly not the case in the autumn of the webinar they were talking about. Well, let's see what the truth is. Ofsted responded to the criticism by forming an advisory group on small schools. As a result, in January 2024, it announced that it would be training its inspectors so they were more aware of the issues that these schools faced. To me, this seems like blaming the inspectors. In fact, what many analysts have pointed out since 2019 is that the problem is the actual inspection framework, which disadvantages small schools where staff hold multiple subject leadership and teachers have classes of mixed ages. A framework that disadvantages some schools because of factors beyond their control offers a poor system of accountability. Well, we also began to worry about the quality of this training when some of the graphics were leaked. I think this must have been for the inspector reception class. Now we have to accept that part of the issue here is that lots of small village schools had been outstanding and thus were then exempt from inspection for many years. There is also some evidence that small primaries did particularly well on the old frameworks. No doubt this long gap between inspections did some of them no favours at all, but to an extent the issue of downgrading the previously outstandings obscured the fact that they were being inspected on a very different framework. They were not being asked to play the same game on the same pitch. Not only the goalposts had changed, but the entire game. Many of the schools in England were built in the late 1800s, often with one school to each village. This resulted in thousands of very small schools, each of which became integral to its community. Some of these have closed, but many have continued to be central to the people who live around them. I suspect that they did rather well out of previous Ofsted frameworks because there was often too little data to make a secure judgment based on outcomes or progress. However, the revised framework has resulted in many of these being downgraded, and this poses a risk to their future. I also often encounter teachers who say they prefer to work in larger schools. Well, if the framework makes these schools even more challenging so that people don't want to lead them or work in them, then it will risk accelerating their demise, and that will have a big impact on the community. In October 2019, a small Catholic primary school in Lancashire was graded outstanding. At that time it had 98 pupils, so it just came within my small schools category of less than 100. A few days later, a new free school in Islington, also with 98 pupils, was graded outstanding in its first inspection. Of course, then COVID struck and the new inspection framework ground to a halt. These schools probably did not realise how unique they were, for they were to be no more outstanding small schools for a very long time. Having become concerned about this issue, I investigated it again once COVID had declined. This chart shows all schools with a graded inspection during the 2021 calendar year. I found no school with under 100 pupils had been judged outstanding in that rather disrupted year. Looking at what had happened to the former outstanding schools that had been re-inspected, often for the first time in years, I saw that many had indeed been downgraded. What was really striking, though, was that none of the primaries with fewer than 200 pupils emerged from a graded inspection with the same grade. They all went down during this time period. The issue then attracted attention from the Times Education Supplement and was reported on by John Roberts in September 2022, and I was involved with that discussion. We can look in more detail at the distribution of grades according to school size across the academic year 21 to 22. What is really striking here is how badly the smallest primary schools were doing, with no outstanding and barely half that were good. They're also much more likely to be inadequate. In contrast, the biggest primaries and the secondaries clearly clocked up quite a number of outstanding grades. Well, there are two possible explanations of this. One might be that small schools were finding it impossible to attract good teachers and leaders, which I do not observe to be the case to this extent, or they were finding it much harder to meet the expectations of the new framework, and that would be unfair. Well, after that, I decided to keep an eye on the patterns in the following autumn term, 2022. Would the new school year bring a change in fortunes for the smallest primary schools? Well, the data showed no real change to the pattern, except there were fewer schools judged inadequate. In fact, it began to look like for many schools we actually had a two-grade framework, either good or requires improvement. Yet it was clear that it was almost impossible for a very small school to be graded outstanding. Something very similar was occurring with the ungraded inspections. When these visited small primaries, they invariably found that there were concerns, almost always about their progress in revising the curriculum. In this case, schools under 200 were all being affected. There was not a lot of difference with the ungraded visits to good schools. Virtually none of these were showing improvement when they were smaller, and a large minority were causing concern. However, the bigger the schools were, the more likely they were to be judged as improving and the less likely to be getting worse. There was a clear pattern here that you can see on this chart. The latest data allows us to investigate what has happened overall since the new framework was introduced up until December 2023. On the first chart, I've calculated the average grade for schools of each size. Just a different way of comparing this, I suppose. What we see here is that there is a consistent pattern of larger schools having a better average grade. Remember that the higher your score on this chart, the worse your grade. Well, this other chart shows the grade split by size of school, again taking them in bands of 100 pupils and covering the whole period. There are a couple of issues here with schools changing their size, which might affect this data, but the overall pattern is very clear. The question is whether your chances of being in an outstanding primary school are related to the size of your school. The largest primary schools have an 11.9% chance of being outstanding based on what has happened so far. Those with between 300 and 400 pupils clock in at 6.4%, and those of 200 to 300 at 5.8%. But the smallest schools are much lower. 100 to 199 pupils is only 3.1%, and those under 100 are a barely discernible 0.7%. What this means in actual practice is that if you are a very small primary, you have barely a 1 in 200 chance of being judged outstanding. So we should finish with the schools from autumn 2023. That term saw a slight upturn. 2 small primaries were graded outstanding. That's more than in some previous years in total. They were Staven in Leicestershire and St Mary's at Colton near Rugeley. That represented just below 2% of the very small schools inspected that term, whereas schools with 400 or more pupils clocked in at 22% of graded inspections being judged outstanding, 10 times the frequency. The average grade for schools with 400 or more pupils was 1.86. For those with under 100, it was 2.24. So actually, the gap seems not to be closing at all. So why has this been happening? Well, arguably, the problem really lies with the inspection framework. Right from the start, school leaders pointed out that its focus on subject expertise and expert subject leadership was unrealistic. It was a model suitable for secondary schools where teachers are appointed on the basis of their ability to teach specific subjects. The argument was that small primary schools have to ask individuals to lead on multiple subjects, and people often have to lead a subject where they've not had formal academic training. Indeed, I visited a school where the head teacher led 4 subjects, and he was only good at 2 of them. Ofsted's new framework imposed great additional pressures regarding curriculum design and planning, whilst at the same time making claims about looking at teacher well-being. Well, none of this was a surprise. The Parliamentary Select Committee had actually refused to endorse Amanda Spielman as HMCI due to her lack of knowledge of primary schools and early years. The framework that she introduced in 2019 confirmed these fears amongst many primary head teachers. Here is an example of a very small school judged requires improvement recently. Good inspection practice is to hold the school to account for the things that it can control. But when we look at the critical areas selected here, they are all affected by the small size of the school. The new curriculum forced on it by Ofsted is not yet embedded. The problem here is that Ofsted's framework forced all schools to redesign the curriculum. The same amount of work for everyone, however big the school. Easier to share it out between 10 staff than 4. Then we have subject knowledge. Again, easier to develop if you have 10 subject leaders rather than 4, one of whom may be the head teacher as well. Or if we compare primary with secondary, staff teaching 10 subjects rather than 1. Finally, we have subject assessment being inconsistent. Again, easier to do if you have multiple subject leaders. You might argue this is just one report, but you can find multiple examples almost exactly like this. So who caused this problem? Well, it is easy to blame the schools and probably easier to blame the inspectors who are getting additional training. But the problem clearly lies with the framework. Senior leaders were warned about that at the beginning, but went ahead anyway. The result is a flawed evaluation system. Well, I hope you found this video interesting and helpful. As well as these videos, I also offer a variety of services for schools, local authorities and academy trusts, with an emphasis on learning about education through evidence and careful evaluation. Services that I offer include help with planning, self-evaluation, auditing of functions, research into vocabulary in classes, and also gathering evidence through online pupil surveys. You can also buy my book about school inspection. Please get in touch or follow me on LinkedIn.